December 7th, 1941. The first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m. Hawaiian time. By 9:45 a.m., the attack was over. By noon, Japanese pilots were landing back on their carriers, celebrating what appeared to be the most successful surprise attack in naval history. 8 American battleships damaged or destroyed. Over 180 aircraft eliminated. More than 2,400 Americans killed. The tactical execution had been flawless. But in the conference rooms of Tokyo, as the initial reports filtered in, a very different conversation was taking place. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, wasn't celebrating, he was calculating. And his calculations were leading him to a terrifying conclusion that would prove devastatingly accurate. Japan had just made the greatest strategic blunder in modern military history. Within 72 hours, it would become clear that Pearl Harbor hadn't crippled American naval power. It had awakened it. The attack hadn't broken American resolve. It had unified it in ways that decades of political rhetoric never could. And most catastrophically of all, the surprise attack hadn't bought Japan the 6 months of breathing room they desperately needed. Instead, it had started a countdown timer that would end with atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the story of how Japan's moment of tactical brilliance became their strategic nightmare. How the most carefully planned military operation of the Pacific War achieved everything it was designed to accomplish, while simultaneously guaranteeing Japan's ultimate defeat. Because sometimes in war, winning the battle means losing everything that matters. The roots of this catastrophe stretched back months before the first Japanese plane took off for Pearl Harbor. By late 1941, Japan faced an impossible situation. The American oil embargo had cut off 94% of Japan's petroleum imports. Their strategic reserves would last perhaps 18 months. Every day of delay meant weaker defenses, fewer resources, dimmer prospects for any military action. The ticking clock was deafening in Tokyo's military planning rooms. Japanese strategists had run the numbers obsessively. A direct confrontation with the United States would be economic suicide. America's industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's by a factor of 10. American oil production was virtually unlimited, while Japan produced almost none. American steel production exceeded Japan's by enormous margins. In any prolonged conflict, these disparities would prove decisive. But Japanese military leaders convinced themselves they had found a solution. One devastating blow to American naval power in the Pacific would create a window of opportunity. 6 months, perhaps 8, during which Japan could consolidate its conquests in Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies, establish defensive positions so strong that when America recovered, the cost of advancing would be prohibitive. Eventually, they reasoned, American public opinion would force a negotiated settlement. The theory was elegant, the execution was masterful, but the fundamental assumptions were catastrophically wrong. Yamamoto himself understood this better than most. He had lived in America, he had studied at Harvard, he had seen American industrial capacity firsthand during his time as a naval attaché in Washington. When pressed by his superiors about Japan's chances in a war with the United States, his response was chilling in its honesty. If we are ordered to fight, I can guarantee to put up a tough battle for the first 6 months, but I have absolutely no confidence about what would happen if it went on longer than that. He understood that Japan was embarking on a war it couldn't win, but by late 1941, the oil embargo had made war seem inevitable. The Pearl Harbor attack plan itself was a work of tactical genius. 6 aircraft carriers approaching from the north, maintaining radio silence, launching 2 waves of attacks designed to catch the American fleet at anchor on a Sunday morning when defenses would be minimal. The intelligence preparation was meticulous. Japanese agents had mapped every ship position, every defense installation, every routine that might provide tactical advantage. But even as the plan took shape, critical flaws were embedded in its strategic logic. The attack was designed to destroy American battleship power, based on the assumption that battleships were the decisive weapons in Pacific naval warfare. This assumption was already obsolete. Carrier aviation was the future of naval combat, and the American carriers weren't at Pearl Harbor that morning. Enterprise was returning from a mission to Wake Island. Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway. Saratoga was in California undergoing maintenance. The three ships that represented America's real naval striking power in the Pacific remained untouched. Japanese planners knew this was possible, but proceeded anyway, convinced that destroying the battleship fleet would be sufficient to achieve their objectives. The second critical flaw was more fundamental. The attack was designed to paralyze American resolve, to shock the United States into accepting Japanese expansion as a fait accompli. Japanese leaders had studied American public opinion polls showing widespread isolationist sentiment. They believed that Americans lacked the will for prolonged warfare, that a devastating surprise attack would convince the United States that war with Japan would be too costly to pursue. This assessment revealed a profound misunderstanding of American psychology. The Japanese had confused American reluctance to enter foreign wars with American unwillingness to defend themselves when directly attacked. They had mistaken isolationist sentiment for weakness rather than recognizing it as a preference for avoiding unnecessary conflicts. The attack itself unfolded with precision that bordered on the supernatural. The first wave of 183 aircraft achieved complete surprise. Radar operators detected incoming planes, but assumed they were American bombers expected from California. The duty officer at Pearl Harbor dismissed the radar contacts without investigation. When Japanese planes appeared over the harbor at 7:55 a.m., American forces were caught completely unprepared. Torpedo bombers struck the battleships moored along Battleship Row, while dive bombers attacked airfields across Oahu. The destruction was systematic and overwhelming. Within the first 30 minutes, the Arizona had exploded and sunk, taking 1,177 sailors with her. The Oklahoma capsized. The California and West Virginia settled to the harbor bottom. The Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee suffered significant damage. American aircraft were destroyed on the ground before pilots could reach them. The second wave of 171 aircraft arrived an hour later, targeting repair facilities, fuel storage, and any remaining military assets. By the time the attack concluded, Japanese forces had achieved virtually every tactical objective. American naval power in the Pacific appeared crippled. The Hawaiian Islands lay defenseless. The path to Japanese expansion seemed clear. But even as Japanese pilots celebrated their success during the flight back to their carriers, the strategic consequences were already manifesting in ways that would prove disastrous for Japan. Radio reports of the attack were reaching the American mainland, where they triggered a response that Japanese planners had never anticipated. Instead of crushing American morale, the Pearl Harbor attack ignited American fury. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a rallying cry that unified the nation. Instantly, isolationist sentiment evaporated overnight. Young men lined up at recruitment offices in numbers that overwhelmed military processing capabilities. Congress declared war with only one dissenting vote in the House of Representatives and none in the Senate. More ominously for Japan, the attack had provided President Franklin Roosevelt with exactly what he needed to mobilize America's vast industrial capacity for total war. Roosevelt had been seeking ways to support Britain and the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany while navigating isolationist sentiment that opposed American involvement in European conflicts. Pearl Harbor eliminated those political constraints completely. Within days of the attack, American factories began converting to military production on a scale that would have seemed impossible months earlier. The arsenal of democracy that Roosevelt had envisioned was becoming reality with unprecedented speed. Auto plants retooled for aircraft production, steel mills expanded capacity for warship construction. The entire American economy was pivoting toward military output with efficiency that stunned observers worldwide. Japanese intelligence services began reporting these developments within weeks of Pearl Harbor, and the implications were terrifying for anyone capable of mathematical analysis. American industrial capacity wasn't just superior to Japan's. It was superior by margins so vast that sustained competition was impossible. The first concrete evidence of America's industrial awakening reached Tokyo by late December 1941. Intelligence reports detail production schedules that defied Japanese expectations. American shipyards were laying down new aircraft carriers at intervals measured in months, not years. The Essex-class carriers under construction would each be larger and more capable than Japan's finest fleet carriers. By 1943, American naval aviation would achieve numerical superiority. By 1944, that superiority would become overwhelming. Japanese naval officers studying these reports experienced a collective moment of horrifying clarity. They had calculated the mathematics of industrial warfare and discovered that Japan had already lost before the first battle was fought. American aircraft production in 1942 would exceed Japan's total by a factor of 4. By 1943, that ratio would increase to 6-1. By 1944, American factories would produce more military aircraft in 3 months than Japan could manufacture in an entire year. The oil situation was even more catastrophic. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, partly to secure access to Dutch East Indies petroleum, but seizing oil fields was only half the equation. The crude oil had to be refined, transported, and distributed to military units scattered across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. American submarine warfare was already disrupting these supply lines with increasing effectiveness. Captain Minoru Genda, one of Pearl Harbor's principal tactical planners, presented a devastating analysis to the Naval General Staff in January 1942. Japanese merchant shipping losses were accelerating beyond replacement capacity. At current attrition rates, Japan would lack sufficient tanker tonnage to transport Indonesian oil by late 1943. The very resource the Pearl Harbor attack was meant to secure would become inaccessible due to American interdiction efforts. But perhaps the most damaging intelligence came from intercepted American communications revealing the true extent of Pearl Harbor's tactical failures. The attack had missed critical infrastructure that would have crippled American recovery efforts for months. The massive fuel storage facilities containing millions of gallons of petroleum remained untouched. The submarine base was ignored completely. The repair shops that would restore most of the damaged battleships were never targeted. More significantly, American damage control capabilities exceeded Japanese estimates dramatically. Ships that Japanese pilots reported as destroyed were being raised, repaired, and returned to service with remarkable speed. The Nevada, which had attempted to escape the harbor during the attack, was repaired and modernized within months. The Pennsylvania emerged from dry dock more capable than before the attack. Even the California and West Virginia, which had settled to the harbor bottom, would eventually rejoin the fleet. Japanese naval intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood American industrial methods. Where Japan relied on craftsmanship and careful construction, America employed mass production techniques that prioritized speed and standardization. American shipyards weren't building individual vessels. They were manufacturing standardized components that could be assembled rapidly using semi-skilled workers. This approach sacrificed elegance for efficiency, but in wartime, efficiency determined victory. The strategic implications became undeniable when American forces launched the Doolittle Raid in April 1942. 16 B-25 bombers taking off from the carrier, Hornet struck targets in Japan itself, including Tokyo. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was catastrophic. Japan's homeland was vulnerable to American attack. The defensive perimeter strategy was already compromised. Japanese military leaders responded to the Doolittle Raid with decisions that would accelerate their defeat. Resources desperately needed for offensive operations were diverted to homeland defense. Fighter squadrons were recalled from forward positions. Anti-aircraft guns were installed around major cities. The raid had achieved exactly what American planners intended, forcing Japan to dilute its strength across defensive commitments that contributed nothing to winning the war. More catastrophically, the Doolittle raid prompted Japanese high command to accelerate the Midway operation, a complex plan designed to lure American carriers into decisive battle. Japanese strategists believed that destroying America's remaining carrier strength would restore the strategic balance disrupted by Pearl Harbor's incomplete success. The Midway operation revealed another fundamental flaw in Japanese strategic thinking. Their battle plans assumed that American forces would react predictably to Japanese moves, that American commanders would make decisions based on Japanese expectations rather than American capabilities and doctrine. This assumption proved disastrously wrong. American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval communications, providing Admiral Nimitz with detailed intelligence about Japanese intentions at Midway. American forces weren't reacting to Japanese moves. They were anticipating them. When Japanese carriers approached Midway on June 4, 1942, they sailed into a carefully prepared trap. The Battle of Midway lasted 3 days and ended Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific permanently. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were destroyed, along with their experienced air crews. Japan lost more naval aviation expertise in 72 hours than they could replace in 2 years. The strategic initiative passed to American forces and would never return. But even before Midway, perceptive Japanese officers recognized that Pearl Harbor had created an impossible strategic situation. The attack had transformed American public opinion from reluctant isolationism to determined vengeance. There would be no negotiated peace, no compromise settlement, no return to pre-war conditions. America was committed to Japan's unconditional surrender, and America possessed the industrial capacity to achieve that objective regardless of Japanese resistance. Admiral Yamamoto himself acknowledged this reality in correspondence with colleagues during early 1942. The Pearl Harbor attack had succeeded tactically while failing strategically in the most comprehensive way possible. Japan had awakened American power while providing moral justification for its unlimited application. Every subsequent Japanese victory would be temporary. Every Japanese defeat would be irreversible. The mathematics of industrial warfare were inexorable. American shipyards would launch more aircraft carriers in 1943 than Japan possessed at the beginning of the war. American aircraft production would exceed Japanese output by margins that made numerical comparison meaningless. American pilot training programs would replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. By mid-1942, Japanese naval officers were privately acknowledging that the war was lost, though such admissions remained politically impossible. The Pearl Harbor attack, intended to prevent American interference in Japanese expansion, had instead guaranteed American dominance in the Pacific. The most successful surprise attack in naval history had become the most counterproductive military operation ever attempted. The tragedy was that many Japanese leaders had understood these risks before Pearl Harbor occurred, but had felt compelled to proceed anyway due to the oil embargo's ticking clock. They had gambled everything on American unwillingness to fight a prolonged war, and they had lost that gamble completely. Pearl Harbor had awakened not just American military power, but American determination to use that power without restraint until Japan surrendered unconditionally. The strategic consequences of December 7th, 1941 would continue unfolding for nearly 4 years, but the ultimate outcome was determined in the first week. After the attack, Japan had chosen war with the one nation capable of defeating them decisively, and they had chosen that war in the manner most likely to ensure their complete destruction. The final realization came not through dramatic revelations or sudden intelligence breakthroughs, but through the grinding accumulation of undeniable evidence throughout 1942. Japanese staff officers, trained in mathematical precision and strategic analysis, watched their carefully constructed projections crumble under the weight of American industrial reality. Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of Japan's most respected military planners, presented a classified assessment to the Imperial General Staff. In August 1942, that read like an obituary for Japanese hopes, American aircraft production for the first half of 1942 had exceeded Japanese estimates by 300%. American shipbuilding capacity was operating at levels that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as propaganda. The Liberty ship program alone was producing merchant vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them in the Atlantic, freeing additional American naval resources for the Pacific theater. But the numbers that truly devastated Japanese confidence came from pilot training assessments. Japan had begun the war with approximately 3,500 carrier-qualified naval aviators, arguably the finest naval pilots in the world. By August 1942, nearly 40% were dead or permanently disabled. The survivors were flying multiple combat missions daily with inadequate rest, accumulating fatigue that degraded performance and increased losses. Meanwhile, American pilot training programs were graduating thousands of new aviators monthly. These pilots lacked the pre-war experience of Japanese veterans, but they possessed advantages that Japanese planners hadn't anticipated. American pilots trained on aircraft identical to those they would fly in combat. They learned standardized tactics that emphasized teamwork over individual skill. Most critically, they trained with unlimited fuel, ammunition, and spare aircraft, luxuries that Japanese pilots had never enjoyed, even in peacetime. The implications were mathematically inescapable. At current attrition rates, Japan would exhaust its experienced pilot pool by early 1943. American pilot production would continue accelerating. By 1944, American naval aviation would possess both numerical superiority and qualitative advantages in equipment and training. The window for Japanese offensive action was closing rapidly. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, found himself presenting increasingly desperate assessments to superiors who refused to acknowledge reality. The tactical success he had achieved 8 months earlier now seemed like ancient history. American carriers were operating with impunity throughout the Pacific, striking Japanese bases with growing frequency and effectiveness. The Guadalcanal campaign, launched by American forces in August 1942, demonstrated everything Japanese strategists had feared about prolonged warfare with the United States. American forces didn't attempt to overwhelm Japanese defenses through superior fighting spirit or tactical brilliance. Instead, they applied overwhelming material advantages systematically and relentlessly. American supply ships arrived at Guadalcanal in convoys protected by superior air cover and naval escorts. They unloaded massive quantities of equipment, ammunition, and supplies before withdrawing to bases beyond Japanese reach. Japanese supply efforts, by contrast, required high-speed destroyer runs under cover of darkness, carrying minimal cargo while exposing valuable warships to constant attack. December 7, 1941, was supposed to be Japan's masterstroke, the brilliant tactical victory that would secure their empire and force American acceptance of the new Pacific Order. Instead, it became the moment Japan guaranteed their own destruction. The attack that was meant to cripple American resolve instead unified it completely. The surprise strike designed to buy Japan 6 months of breathing room instead awakened industrial capacity that would overwhelm them within 2 years. Pearl Harbor succeeded tactically, while failing strategically in the most catastrophic way imaginable, proving that sometimes the most perfectly executed plan can be the most perfectly wrong decision.